This is an exciting time for me to be able to spend a little time with my friend William Vanderbloemen. Hey, William, how are you?
Doing great, Tim. How are you?
Great. I'm so excited to have your new book come out next. Give me the 30-second elevator speech on what Next is about and how you and Warren Bird from Leadership Network came up with the idea.
Tim, the big idea behind the book is a thought that dawned on me a few years back, and that's this. Every pastor is an interim pastor. Doesn't matter how long or short you're going to stay somewhere, someone will follow you. I mean, the only other options are you run the church into the ground and close it, which is an option some people take, and then maybe your pastor when Jesus returns, or when Nicolas Cage is flying his plane over the ocean in a month or two when Left Behind comes out. Another not so great option. So our big idea is, let's get over the fact that everyone's gonna move at some point. It's kind of been a taboo subject for a long time. If you talk about the fact that you might move one day, well, then that must mean you really don't want to be here anymore, you don't love me anymore, you're dating another church. When the reality is, smart churches will plan ahead. Big corporations are learning that the succession conversation is the primary function of the board. We read about a number of Fortune 100 companies that have the agenda for the first meeting with their brand new CEO. The lead-off agenda item is, let's talk about your succession. Because everyone is going to have a successor. So Warren and I set out and studied about 500 different pastoral transitions. We did case studies on around 200 pastoral successions and did interviews. We interviewed folks that have done a great job. One church that's had 3 successive successions that have gone well for long tenured pastors. We talked to everybody who did not work out at First Baptist Dallas, which took a while. And we talked to the Schulers, so good, bad, ugly. I mean, we really tried to run the gamut to say, what are the irreducible principles about succession, and how can we create a highly readable, research-backed blueprint for pastors to take their boards through and have a conversation that really has been dormant for too long.
Okay. You just used the term blueprint, which you and I have known each other for a lot of years, and my specialization is facilities, not staffing. So let me ask you a couple of questions about the succession planning piece of it and how it ties to maybe even the facilities related to the church. Do you see the succession planning being similar to what a church would do from a master planning standpoint of their facility master plan?
Yes, and I don't know facility master planning that well, so I might be misstating things. But I think what we've learned is there are a few things that have to be in place, and then everything else is highly contextual. And because you're dealing with people and not inanimate things, the situation can change, and smart boards will take a look at their succession plan every year. There are also layers of succession planning, some of which are very much like a short-term blueprint. An emergency succession plan. What happens if the pastor gets sick, or the pastor's wife is sick, or if something terrible happens and the tenure of the pastor ends abruptly? That needs to be in place for everybody. I would imagine churches that are trying to build a big building and get a good loan on an insurance rate would do well not only to have a key man life insurance policy, but also be able to go to a lender and say, and here is our concrete plan for what happens if the worst happens.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So when you think of terms of a facility is only a tool of ministry. It is not the ministry. It is not the church. So how does that relate to the staff, and particularly to a lead pastor? The lead pastor obviously isn't the church. He's leading the church. So how would you see that kind of planning for facility and for staff where the lead pastor is not the church? And how do you set it up so that the church does not just totally crumble when it is time for him to move on?
I think a lot of that's naturally happening through the multi-site movement. I mean, you've got some larger churches that were built at the height of the church growth, attractional model era of the 90s and the 2000s, and you've got some pastors that are getting older and will have to retire, and there's a 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10,000 seat arena that's got to be paid for and filled, and If you can't find the super dynamic person that can walk right in and fill it, then you've got a real problem. Some of our clients that we do search work for in the multi-site movement, some very well-known ones, in fact, have a clear emergency succession plan that, the multi-sites just break into a loose confederation of churches and the lead pastors take over, and it's a different thing than it was, but at least it doesn't just crumble and die from the very beginning. So we've actually walked a number of those churches that have very large facilities through a succession plan, and I think the conversation's starting to happen earlier and earlier. And if you can start that conversation earlier and earlier, then it can happen. Now, Southeast Christian Church in Louisville has a huge facility. They've been through a very successful transition with Bob Russell, and now Dave Stone is preparing the way for the guy that will follow him. So it's depending on the size of the facility. That's just one of a myriad of factors that comes into play when you're trying to think about what the succession plan will look like.
Okay. So in succession planning, how much of it is setting up the next generation for church, and how much of it is leaving a legacy of what you've done in the past?
One thing that's interesting, that's too long a story to tell without reading the book, is a whole lot of the churches that do well with succession and making the transition are churches that are future-oriented. And that doesn't mean contemporary or cutting edge, but they're always looking for what the next thing is that'll happen. Successful incoming pastors that take over after long-tenured pastors, almost all of them love history. It's hilarious. And they're good at looking back and remembering the stories of the past and telling them in front of the congregation. And so the marriage of those two personalities often makes for a good succession.
Okay. So who should be doing this kind of planning? Obviously, the lead pastor should be, but who else on their staff should be doing this kind of planning?
The top two people in a succession plan are the same every time: the outgoing pastor and the outgoing pastor's spouse. We didn't know it when we set out to write the book, but we learned some really interesting stories and statistics about just how much rises and falls on the outgoing pastor and on the outgoing pastor's spouse. And that's not to villainize or criticize anybody that has done a bad job. There really is no vocation that I can think of that consumes all of your life like ministry does. It's where you go for your spiritual edification. It's where you go to work. It's where you go for your friendships, for your community, for your sense of identity. And when it goes away, all those things go away. And so unless the outgoing pastor, and I would also say the spouse, is totally on board and leading the conversation, the succession conversation is not one that can be forced. That's why we wrote the book primarily for pastors, and hopefully for pastors that are younger. When I was a pastor in my early 30s here at a large church in Texas, I had the chance to hang out with John Maxwell quite a bit during those years. And one time we were together, he said, I said, "What should I be doing right now, John?" And he said, "Right now, you should be creating options for later on." Smart pastors thinking far enough down the road that they'll be able to, A, have the money to retire, B, have other areas of interest they can pour their time into, and C, have a solid enough marriage that they'll be able to weather the storm of a complete identity shift.
Okay. Is there a size church that this is more critical than others? And is there a size church that it just doesn't matter?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I know Lyle Schaller, one of those fathers of church growth wisdom, used to say small churches are like cats. They got 9 lives. You couldn't kill them if you wanted to. But a large church is more like a whale, and when they're without a pastor, they're a beached whale, and they're in deep trouble. I tend to agree with that to some extent. No matter how good the system is, the larger the church, the more hinges on the personality and communication skills of the lead pastor.
Okay. So in all of the interviews that you did with the churches that you and Warren went and met with, or maybe that you've seen even since Vanderbloemen Search Group has been started, what are some of the biggest mistakes that churches have done or boards have done, besides just the failure of not having a plan? What are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen that you can help give people advice to avoid going down the road?
Right. Well, one thing is there is no cookie cutter. And you see pastors who go to a conference and come back with the 9 steps for doing this, that, or the other. That doesn't work with succession planning. And folks who try and say, well, they did it this way at Southeastern, so that's how we ought to do it. There is no cookie cutter. It is so contextual and different from situation to situation. The second thing I'd say, and it sounds so crass, but it really is money. And sometimes it's a pastor's failure to do proper financial planning. But you asked what churches could do. I would say make sure they're paying their pastor well at a fair wage, not just the lowest wage possible. Because church boards run this this balancing act. They're not supposed to spend more than they need to because they're a nonprofit, and they're to steward the gifts that are given. But they also need to pay well enough to take care of their pastor. Study after study that we did showed great pastors, often of large churches, really had nothing to allow them to retire. So in the book, we spend a whole chapter talking about preparing finances, little things like the church offering an annual or every other year day of financial planning with a certified financial planner, making sure that retirement funds are being set up so that there aren't golden handcuffs on the pastor that make them stay longer than they should. One thing that we're yet to see a church do, but we really think should happen and does happen in the corporate world is, let's all agree together, church and board, what would be the clear markers that we could look at on an every year or every 2 or 3 year basis that would enable us to say, we've now flattened out, we're starting to get a little stagnant, it's time to talk about a transition. Usually if you can put those markers in place in the corporate world ahead of time, well, the CEO is not surprised when a transition conversation comes up. We don't do that in the church world. And it doesn't have to be about numbers or attendance, but if there were clear markers put in place, I think that the conversation would not be a surprise to the outgoing pastor.
I don't know that you recall, but my dad was a pastor in a denominational church for most of my younger years. And I remember him saying that the people on the board used to pray, God, you keep them humble, we'll keep them poor. And that, unfortunately, is too often the mindset of particularly smaller churches. And being a denominational church, my dad's denomination's pension fund went belly up for several years before retirement. And if he hadn't had other money set aside, I don't know where they'd be today. And so great advice for any size church, but particularly the smaller churches that are on a shoestring budget for the pastors. So we look at the downside of things. Of the ones that you saw that are really knocking it out of the park, what are 2 or 3 of the attributes that are just key benchmarks of a successful plan?
Well, let's talk about a smaller church for a minute. My home church had a great succession plan in place. They'd have been happy for pastors to stay there for 20, 25 years, but they really saw themselves as a launching pad. And if a pastor came in 5, 6, 7 years and took off to become president of a seminary or a pastor of a much larger church, they viewed that as a win and not as a you don't love me anymore. So, church is getting clear on what is the expectation of a pastorate here. Pastors on average serve 18 years in the local church, shorter than you might think. Pastors on average experience at least 2 transitions during their career. So if a board can get clear that the pastor might not be here forever, that would be super helpful. I think if the church could do some positive things on the front end to secure a legacy for the pastor. A lot of smart churches we've seen have pastors who, when they start to hit maybe third base on the baseball diamond, develop an affinity for missions in India or helping with habitat or you name it, some area of passion. And rather than seeing that as moonlighting, smart churches just get on board and say, let's help stoke that fire so that when the time comes for transition, part of the pastor's transition can be the church saying, you know what, you love doing this so much. One client we had a pastor who had a passion for missions in Asia. And they said, we know you love this so much that we want to fund your position for the first 3 years so that you've got plenty of time to be self-supporting. And they gave him a springboard into a new career, finances that would last, and everybody walked away friends in a situation that could have gone a whole lot differently.
So as you guys have looked back at the book, and with it now coming out, and everyone needs to get a copy of, obviously, of the book next, how would you and Warren define a win? If people read this book and they get what out of it, will it be a win for you all?
Well, kind of ending where we began, I feel like the conversation about succession has been taboo. Pastors and churches view each other more like a marriage than like a business contract. And even though it's God's calling, you know, they really couldn't keep Jesus in any one church. He seemed to wander from village to village. And Paul didn't sit still very long either. So, you know, pastors are going to come and go. And the win for us would be that churches would start to have this conversation and realize it's a normal part of life and one of the chief functions of the pastor and the board. Honestly, we wrote this book thinking about a lot of the baby boomers who are about to end their careers. But as we finish the book, we're hoping that the 30-year-old pastor picks it up and reads it and starts owning the conversation throughout their career. And it is time for a new conversation. If you think about it, Bill Hybels planted Willow Creek. It's been almost 40 years now. It's 1975. Rick Warren planted Saddleback in 1980, so it's 35 years. And those guys have a lot of years left in them. But it is clear that sooner or later they're going to transition their church. They were part of a large group of pastors that really pioneered a new way of talking about the church with a business savvy and maintaining a spiritual undergirding. So it's only natural that now that they're hitting the autumn of their career, we could have a sophisticated and spiritual conversation about how transitions can go better. So our hope is it's really a conversation starter and a help for churches as they figure out their own unique plan for how they're going to handle transitions.
Great. Do you happen to have a copy of the book close by?
What do you know? Right here.
Right there. Okay, so everyone needs to get their copy of Next. It's a Baker House, is that correct?
Baker, yep. And if you go to nextpastor.com, you'll find links to every place on the planet that sells it. So nextpastor.com will take you there.
Sounds great. Well, William, I am so excited for you and Warren, and what a great tool to offer to pastors as we continue to go through this journey and leading churches through all the different things that they need to navigate. Thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Tim. God bless.